we recognize that there is an imperative to put a price on pollution and an imperative to help Canadian families adjust.
Canadians have known all along that Justin Trudeau's carbon tax was just a tax plan dressed up as an emissions plan. But now we know it's really also just an election gimmick.
The idea that we need to limit our emissions is important. The way we implement it has to be done in a way that's progressive.
It's a cynical attempt by the Trudeau government to buy your vote with your money.
People don't want this tax. This carbon tax does nothing for the environment.
We all knew it was coming. The provinces heard the warnings, and this week the federal government revealed its plan to impose its own carbon tax on those who refused one. The critics have already come out swinging, as you heard there, accusing the Liberals of buying votes by giving rebates directly to taxpayers. Because after all, the election is now less than a year away, and thankfully At Issue is here to break it all down. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Vancouver tonight, and Paul Wells is here in Ottawa. Good to see you all. Okay, the federal backstop, this thing that they announced this week. Chantal, is it good policy? Does it make sense?
Yes, there's plenty of evidence that supports the contention that it is good policy. I think the main goal policy-wise of the government is to introduce the framework for carbon pricing and go on from there. So the levels will probably not meet the emissions target or the reductions that we should be looking at to meet our international commitments. So I think their theory is once you get the framework in, then you can work with it.
Andrew, so the idea that you would pay more for certain things because gas and oil are being used, and then you would get a rebate. I should point out it's not a monthly check; it's sort of an end of year thing. Does that seem like sound policy to you?
Yeah, I mean the impact on the environment is from the pricing of the carbon dioxide. That signal, that incentive remains in place even if you give people back a rebate, because they're still better off the more that they can cut back on their consumption. If they can't cut back on their consumption at all, then they're covered by the rebate. But if they can, and most people can cut back in some way or another, then they get to save more of that rebate. So the fiscal incentive remains in place. It's very good policy. It's patchy. They've put in all kinds of exceptions for various sectors and various parts of the country, et cetera. And of course, they're doing this on top of all the other less well-considered policies that are already in place, plus more that they're adding. And I think most small C conservative advocates of a carbon price, carbon tax, would like to see it replacing those measures rather than simply being layered on top of them.
Paul, you suggested in your column this week that it might be so efficient that other provinces will want to buy in, even though they have their own plans. And I think Andrew's point is a good one. We don't really know how it's going to change people's behavior. It's possible it will change it more dramatically or less dramatically, and that's the part I think that is difficult for the government to project.
So I was being a little tongue-in-cheek. What I was saying is, if it is so obvious that this is a better plan, then in the other provinces, yes, people are going to be scrambling to get in. I was told the next day by Jason Kenney for a story that I'm preparing that in fact the rebate is more generous as a penalty for living in Doug Ford's Ontario. You get a penalty that's more generous than the one you get as a reward for living in Rachel Notley's Alberta. Of course, that's the kind of the kind of point that Jason Kenney would make, but it points out, look, I'm not even sure this is good policy. People will say better late than never. But it's late because this government is going to be introducing this tax in the fourth year of its mandate. If it had gone quickly and in an agile way with piecemeal measures, there are literally hundreds of things that could have been done while instead of spending 2 years playing chicken with the provinces. And the details are almost hallucinatory. Your rebate check is twice as big in Saskatchewan than your rebate check in Ontario. People will say that's because of energy usage patterns, but each Ontarian doesn't feel like half a Saskatchewanian, and that sort of stuff is going to start to matter.
Well, and you've got Brian Pallister. You've got Brian Pallister in Manitoba complaining that why was Manitoba kicked out of the plan? Their plan was judged to be not good enough for the feds, and yet Newfoundland's is. And yes, I think that will probably bear some scrutiny as to are politics being played here where you've got liberal fortunes riding very heavily on Quebec and Atlantic Canada. Did they look the other way? Did they accept a plan that was less than optimal not so as not to have to fight with Newfoundland as well as everybody else.
So is it good politics then, Chantal? It sounds like maybe for some parts, but not the other.
Well, we are for one captive or prisoners of our recent history, in the sense that under Stephen Harper, a number of provinces decided to take matters in their own hands, as they could and as the voters in those provinces believed that they should. So Quebec got itself into a carbon market. BC introduced a carbon tax. This is a decade's worth of public policy that has generated a wide political consensus. So the notion that the federal government of the day, Justin Trudeau, could walk in and say, forget all of those things that you've done, dismantle them, because I'm going to be introducing a plan, makes no sense. But I don't think that a year ago the Liberals believed that they would have to fight an election on this, because less than a year ago they had a buy-in in Ontario on carbon pricing, not only from the Liberals, who were threatened with not getting re-election, but also from the Patrick Brown Conservatives.
Okay, I want to play a clip of Andrew Scheer where he, you'll see what he says, but and then frame it in that way about whether this is going to end up being an election about what people choose to do or not do, or variations of it. Here's what Andrew Scheer said.
Large industrial polluters have been granted a special exemption. They won't pay anything under this plan, while hardworking individual Canadians and families will bear the full brunt of this new tax. Canadians won't be tricked by this. They know an election gimmick when they see one.
So his plan, he's been promising it for months now, and it has yet to happen. It seems to be something to do with how the globe can reduce climate emissions. I don't know how that works, but Paul, would this be an election issue, and how serious a plan does Andrew Scheer have to have in order to counter what the Liberals have put forward?
I have a hard time imagining that this will not be at least one of the major issues in the next election, and probably it'll swamp everything else. It's too close to the modern Conservative Party's roots and self-image in the resource-producing West. It's too close to the pride of the Liberals, of the Trudeau Liberals, in fact, in being the first generation of Liberals to actually want to do something about this. And so even, forget electoral calculations, both sides feel it too much. I have a feeling they're going to want to scrap over this. How much of a plan does Andrew Scheer need? Well, I'll tell you this. Here's how much of a plan Justin Trudeau had in 2015. The word carbon appears 10 times in the Liberal platform in 2015. 6 of those times it was a carbon fund that it was somehow magically going to pay out. It was going to be money that you got instead of money that you received. And 4 mentions of carbon in Justin Trudeau's platform were vague and passing references to pricing. That's how much Justin Trudeau needed to get elected. So I don't know, how much does Andrew Scheer need?
What do you think, Andrew? Is this a thing that could galvanize people to go vote? Would it get them new voters? That to me seems the issue as well. I don't see how you pick up new voters on issues where you're this deeply entrenched.
It may or may not be the election issue, because anytime you can see an issue coming from a mile away, often as not, parties move to kind of neutralize it and prevent it from being the issue. They try to make sure they don't lose on it. I think we've been watching all along for several years now to see how serious the public really is about climate change and dealing with climate change. I think the correct bet is proving to be they're not that serious. And I think the Conservatives have felt that all along, and I think the Liberals have laterally made that clear that they think so. So in the Liberal case, we'll make sure you don't have to actually pay anything for it. We'll compensate you for any out-of-pocket expenses. So hoping that people won't be put out that way. In the Conservative case, I think they'll need to have something called a plan. That plan will contain a lot of busy work of the kind that we've seen before, of subsidies and regulations that won't actually do anything, but the costs of which will be hidden from consumers. And they'll bet that people will be content, even if they somehow know at the back of their mind that they're actually paying for these things. I think there's a part of people that just says, just don't show it to me, just don't put it in front of my face. And I hate to be so cynical, but I suspect that's the case.
Chantal, on that point, whether it could be an election issue,
I'm not convinced that it's going to be that easy to get away with. I don't have much of a plan, but you won't see a carbon tax for 2 reasons. Younger voters, and they did help Justin Trudeau by showing up in droves compared to previous years, and voting for the Liberals by a proportion of almost 2-1, take this issue more seriously than their elders. And two, the carbon tax issue, like Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. I was in Vancouver when all this was rolled out, and it was not even a major news story. Why? Because it's not happening in BC, where people have voted for parties that are all into carbon pricing.
Right.
Same in Quebec. So you've got voters in two large electoral markets, excuse me, Ontario, that actually have been living under a carbon pricing regime for 10 years and who have not kicked anybody out of office over it, on the contrary.
Okay, I have like a minute 30, so this is going to be hard to do, but thoughts on what is happening in the United States? I mean, the political divisiveness we've been seeing for, years, but obviously ramped up right now leading up to the midterms. And this may or may not be what is causing these explosive devices to be mailed around. It seems to be some sort of political motivation behind that. Why are we not seeing that polarization? Good luck answering this in a minute and a half in Canada. Paul, quick answer.
I'm not sure the difference is that great. I mean, Faith Goldie, a hard right candidate for mayor in Toronto, got 25,000 votes. I have to spend about a half hour on Twitter to see all kinds of people calling one another the most horrible names. The United States has all that, plus probably one loner mailing out pipe bombs. I don't think that's a huge difference, I'm afraid.
The U.S. has always been a society that goes to more extremes than Canada, going back through their history. They've also been through a series of traumas in recent years, whether you're talking about the financial crisis, the terrorist attacks, the Iraq War, none of which we've experienced to anything like the same degree. Plus they have this phenomenon of the self-sorting, of people moving into more conservative areas, more liberal areas, self-sorting themselves and never really having to do anything to do with people unlike themselves. So add all that up and you've got the recipe for this kind of toxicity.
Chantal.
But we also have less wedges on central issues. No one anywhere is campaigning against public health care. We don't have anti-immigration mainstream parties or mainstream politicians. We no longer fight all that much over abortion access, same-sex marriage, go down the list. All these issues are issues that are still act as wedges in the U.S.
Okay. Smart talk tonight. Thanks everybody for being here. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue the podcast for extra content. This week we're going to talk about, I feel like we've talked about this a number of times, but the federal NDP losing yet another MP, what this means for the party's momentum or lack thereof. Look for it on iTunes and any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.